Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to our second channel geography video. This is Everyone's Favorite Series where I talk about geography and the world and stuff. And today I wanted to talk about transnational unions because I know that phrase gets you really excited. But no, I wanted to talk about the idea of country unions like the EU and I guess the other continent equivalents of the EU because I find them to be a really interesting invention to kind of combat the rise of countries. If you don't know, the number of countries in the world is consistently rising. That's one of the big trends of especially the last century. Back at the end of World War I in 1918, there were 59 countries that did exist, roughly 59 countries that did exist, and as of 2018, as I record this video, there's around 200 countries. Again, measuring a country is kind of tricky, but that means that the number of countries has more than tripled in that time, and the amount of space we have on Earth, I mean, unless there's a new continent that no one's told me about, has not tripled in that time, and instead, the existing countries have simply split up into smaller, more manageable units, or smaller, whatever you want to call them, but they've split up into smaller units, which means they have a lot of benefits. Smaller countries, generally speaking, means more self-governance, which means they can, again, deal with local issues on a better level. They can deal with a lot of things better on the local level. I think it's generally accepted that more things are dealt with better when you have a local thing, but the downside is lots of issues are actually dealt with better by a huge country, by the empires before. There were some benefits to the empires of the Europeans, and these included trade. Trade is much easier to do within the same country, and also includes, to some extent, the monetary side. So, having a strong currency that's used worldwide, like how the dollar is kind of beneficial, and also includes defense. Defense, at the very least, is better when you have military agreements, and if you had like a common military, like say the US, it leads to this big situation, and given that, the EU is formed kind of as like a countenance of the America, because again, think about it, when you've got lots of smaller countries, they all realize that America, the world power at the time, the world military power, the world trade power, the world, again, they had all of the, the things that were better sorted by a large country, but still had the, strong level of local governments. Like every state in America has some amount of strong, so maybe that's one of the reasons for success, but every state in America has its own powers and stuff, and other countries figured they could replicate this, and this is kind of where a lot of the influence for the EU is coming from. This is kind of where a lot of the influence for these other places are coming from, and basically it leads this fun situation where we have a bunch of competing, like, union-style countries, which means that arguably we'll have more countries than ever in the next 50 years, but we're also going to have less countries than ever in some specific ways. So, yeah, let's talk about the EU first, because, again, I find this to be the first and most interesting of all of them, the most fleshed out, that you're probably aware of, so, again, we don't want to dive too far into it, but here's the EU, in case you don't know. It's made up of 28 member states. It is 28. People are like, aha, but it doesn't include the UK. Look, that's an old map. No, this map will be old in 2019, when the UK leaves officially. Again, if it does, and, well, it will, but, like, again, this will change in 2019. But now this is the map. You'll notice how there's some holes in Western Europe, with Switzerland, Norway, and with Iceland. However, these three countries, they're all, like, again, they're EEA members, so they're in the same economic area, and basically these countries all share a common, or, like, some of these countries share a common currency, some of them have, like, defense initiatives, not quite the common defense thing, although that's apparently slowly happening, but interestingly enough, they also all share a common trade area where you can trade things with each other. It's all easy, and most of them are in a customs union too, where they can all, again, all the goods can flow freely from one to the other. There's no tariffs. You can trade easily with someone in Germany. There's no issues. You just buy the thing off them. They can give it to you. You can deal business. Again, it's anyone from any country can deal business with anyone else, which again, for the most part, means like centered around Germany because they're the industrial power, but it's still something rather interesting like that. Although, arguably, France and the UK bring the military power because of the whole, like, nuke thing. But anyway, let's just mention the fact that's the EU. Boom. Easy stuff. Everyone knows about it. We don't need to talk about it too much. But what I did find is interesting is when I went to, like Singapore for the first time, I learned about the ASEAN, the Association of Southeastern, Asian Nations, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There we go. I found that to be quite interesting because, again, I thought there was a few unions in the world at the time, but it turns out that pretty much every part of the world has its own little union. So the first one I want to mention here, because it's direct competition to the EU, is actually, I guess it's the name always gets me up. It's like the EEU. It's very similar to the EEA, but it's for the Russian-backed states. So it looks like this. It looks very similar to a map of the USSR, and that's because it mostly includes former USSR countries. It has Belarus in there. It has a few of it has Kazakhstan. Has a few of these countries right here. And it's really interesting because for Eastern European countries, for these almost like Russian, for these countries between the EU and Russia, there's kind of like a choice between do you join the EU or do you join the EEA? Like, it's kind of interesting like that. So there's kind of like competition between these unions, which has to be a good thing, right? Like, oh yeah, problem with super states is like, they just get too big. Well, what if you have two of them competing? Well, that's where Ukraine gets the deal. They're actually tearing themselves in half of that. And interestingly enough, Armenia decided to join the EU versus the EEA because, again, you have to kind of decide, like, oh yeah, is Russia the dominant power or is Germany the one you want to be dealing with? Or, again, the EU as a whole, because it's not quite the same there, where there's, like, one big country, like there is in some other continents. And yeah, basically, there's the EU. It's kind of a competitor to the EU, but realistically, at least in my opinion, it's kind of like it's kind of not the same thing because it doesn't have anywhere near as deep trade ties. And again, when Russia says like, let's make a big union around us, you have to be a bit suspicious when you're Armenia this size and Russia's over there that size. It's just something you gotta be suspicious of. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually going to be the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because again, Asia as a continent has 3 of these separate unions. Like, again, every continent for the most part has their own one. There's the African Union, there's the South African Union, let's just call them for now. However, when it comes to Asia, there's actually 3. There's the EEU, like I mentioned with Russia, even though it's technically European-ish, but they have Kazakhstan, so whatever. But there's also the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which looks something a bit like, it looks something a little bit like this. So, as you can see, this is all of the countries in Southeast Asia, going all the way up to Australia. And basically, the map, though, you can see mostly Indonesia here, like, Indonesia is most of the area, then you got Malaysia, and then you get, like, it's really easy to see what they all look like right there. So again, it goes all the way up to Burma right here, it goes all the way down to here, and it basically just includes this huge area having a free trade agreement. It's in the earliest stages of its development. It has way lower ambitions than, again, the EU and the EU, where like, oh yeah, we could make like almost country style things, almost like the United States, but with Europe, or with the former Soviet Union. Like, wouldn't it be cool to get the gang back together? With the ASEAN, given that the nations have a vast range of differences, this mostly is an economic partnership, so they all have like visa-free access to each other, for instance. That's a nice deal they got going on there. They all have like some priority access to each other's countries. They've got a lot of things like that, and they have, again, good trade links, and the border controls between them are being lowered. A lot of stuff like that's going down. But the truth is, it's such a disparate range of countries across the area, and again, trying to make a union like that is kind of tricky. Although, interesting enough also, China and Japan are like observer states, even though they're not Southeast Asia. So yeah, there's the ASEAN, which is like the kind of Asia as you would imagine it, but it's only Southeast Asia and only covers like a very particular thing. Again, has a lot of benefits. They have a common air market already, by the way, which means that you can fly any airline to any airline, which is why I went on the worst flight ever with apparently it said it was a Thai airline, but it was actually, as it turned out, a Indonesian airline. But I could have taken a Thai airline from Singapore to Jakarta in Indonesia, because they have the free air market like there is in the EU. So again, they've got some things going down, again, mostly the business side of things. They don't have the lofty plans for the huge single currency, at least not just yet. So with that said, let's move on next to talk about the I guess the Gulf Union, because the it's called the it's called the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. Not quite so catchy. Doesn't include all of the Gulf, because again, you got a lot of stuff like Yemen there, where it's like, ooh, that's Yemen. They've still got their fun fact, Yemen still has 2 capitals, because one of them kind of isn't a capital, or was under siege. You've also got, like, again, looking around the area, you can see why you don't have all the countries, but it basically consists of all the oil rich, although then there's of course Qatar, which is natural gas rich, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, it's like a lot of rich countries that are like, let's do this, let's make a more stable thing, and Saudi Arabia is the big player. But of course, United Arab Emirates, which you probably know for Dubai, but all the UAE, obviously quite notable too. Qatar, quite notable too, quite famous too, and Oman has a fair bit of area too. So all these 6 countries to come together, they have a common currency unit, which is interesting because the common currency unit is like, it exists, but only in its theoretical stage. So even though it's like, the euro before it existed was based on like every European currency exchanged with at a fixed rate. This is in that stage, but it's unlikely to go further because issues that we'll get into. The GCC also, for some reason, again, it's pretty interesting because all these unions focus on different things. The EU is very heavily focused on like integration of the free trade stuff in particular, but then like also want to go for the other things. Whereas this is very, very strictly focused on like, let's get that trade going, let's make our countries boom together. Because again, oil is going to run out sometime. Let's make sure we're ready for that stuff, and that's why they're doing a lot of really interesting things together, such as rail investment with each other. So they're making sure all their countries connect by rail. Again, they're just really heavily connecting the countries, I guess. Which is, again, it's not necessarily something you do at a like transnational body level, but it's something they did right here, which is, again, just a little bit fascinating if you ask me. However, the reason this is notable is not because, oh yeah, they're doing some good trade stuff with each other, they have that common currency unit, and they're building rail lines into each other. It's because of the fact that they, recently, this body right here, the, the Gulf Cooperation Council, these states right here, one more time. Again, you can really see how Saudi Arabia takes it most of it. All actually decide to blockade Qatar in because, mostly because of Al Jazeera. Qatar really wants to have its own foothold in the world and have its own power, and it does that via soft power, which means that they can, they basically want to influence countries in friendly ways. Kind of like how, you know, the UK technically isn't powerful anymore, but like in some situations gets power because like people are like, oh yeah, that UK way of thinking is kind of nice. So it's some kind of same thing. They want to be like that, but in the Middle East. So yeah, other countries don't like that, or maybe terrorism. Again, it really, it's such a tricky issue, you can't say one way or the other, but there's two reasons. There's the reason they say, which is terrorism, and there's the reason that makes sense geopolitically, which is the influence thing that they want to stop, because Al Jazeera has, like, toppled governments, and they don't want to topple their own governments. Like, you know, fun fact, governments don't like being toppled. So, there you go, there's Qatar, that's why Qatar Airways, I think that's what they're called. The airline in Qatar, I flew with them, I don't know their name though. They have to fly all the way around all these countries, including Kuwait, which means they have to fly over Iran and Turkey sometimes, and Iraq, and basically, their airspace got cut down, which makes all of their flights a little bit longer, which means that longest flight in the world I mentioned from earlier, even though it should go a route like this, actually has to go around like that. So guess what? Longest flight in the world just got longer because of this whole thing. And as because I flew from Qatar to the UK, I had to fly like round there, and because of that, flights with them are cheaper, at least, I mean, cheaper in my experience, cheaper in like business class or whatever. if you want to fly like the most luxurious airline in the world, you can do it. This sounds like an advertisement for Qatar, I swear. I just like their service one time. So yeah, with that said, let me move on from talking about the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, to talking about the next union here. So again, we've got 3 on the same continent. We've got ASEAN, we've got the EU, and we've got the, which sounds a lot like the EU, right? And then we've got there's also the CIS, the Commonwealth Independent States, but that's not the powerful body. We've got the GCC, but then we've got over here in Africa, the African Union. So the African Union is suspiciously similar to the European Union in its like end goals. Like, would it be nice if we had a currency and we're all like Africans? But they actually do have a stated goal of being, so this is the African Union. It's a really easy one to look at because guess what? All of Africa with like, I mean, just ignore that stuff. So yeah, all of Africa, let's just say for now, is in the African Union. There's like a few like states that go in and out and stuff, but that's just all of Africa is in the the Union for now. Let's just say that, and the African countries actually have an end goal of being the United States of Africa. So the interesting thing about that is that they'd be called the USA. So probably not going to pick that name in the end, but they actually do eventually have that end goal. Even though, again, one of these countries doesn't really exist as a country, they all have that like kind of end goal of like, let's integrate the economy so well, let's make Africa the best continent in the world. And given that Africa, again, is like, look how big it is, I mean, compared to other continents, it's a realistic goal, given that they also have some of the fastest population growths in the world. If they can, you know, get their country infrastructure, if they can make this stuff magically happen, then they might have a shot at that. But the truth is the African Union has a bunch of issues on every level, where like, guess what, trying to take 50 countries, because again, look how many countries there is, which vary as much as, you know, South Africa to Morocco, vary as much as like, you know, Kenya to Egypt. The variance in the countries and the reform levels make it a lot trickier, and given that all the bodies operate independently, basically, my favorite way to kind of just show like how much of a mess this can be is this map right here. So here's all the bodies in Africa, here's how many of them have joined. As you can see, African Union includes them all, but then, also, African Union does include them all, but then it's just a bit like, but the ECOWAS only includes these states, and then this is I looked into it a bit, and it's just really tricky, and the long story short is you can expect, so there's going to be a brand new country at some point involving these countries right here. The East African, they're going to be the East African Frank. I feel they're actually calling it. It's like East Africa, going to be a country right here someday with these countries. And then the rest, it's like a lofty goal. But again, so many things can happen before you get all these countries to agree that it's hard to be certain with that. And along this, the opposite lines of that, where their stated goal is the United States of Africa, but they're moving towards it, it's really tricky. We have the opposite situation where we have, I'll be honest, the name of it always escapes me because it's like the Union, the South American Union of Nations. No, wait, it'd have to be like Union of South American Nations, which is suspiciously similar to ASEAN. I guess they like UCON. The Union of South American Nations looks like this. Includes every country on South America, with the exception of France, because France is too busy being part of the EU, and French Guiana is part of the EU too, technically, in this really weird way where they use the euro. I mean, again, just let's not question that. This is France, okay? Every country that isn't in the EU on this continent actually exists in the Union of South American Nations. And the cool thing about the Union of South American Nations, besides the fact that they're the villain, I think it's Call of Duty Ghosts. So, watch out for them and space weapons. Don't let them have a space program. But no, seriously, the cool thing about this continent is the fact that they're kind of like far apart from the rest of the world. Like, although they have links to America, North America, although they have links to that continent right there, there's no direct link to it. They should have a road link, but the Darien Gap, I've gone over this before, but I think at least, but there's a gap between South America and North America, where if you want to cross it, you have to go over 50 miles of wilderness, and you can't drive between North America and South America, so there's essentially like they're separated. So yeah, the connections should be good, but they're not even by air or even by like boat. So yeah, these countries, they all have an agreement, like, let's trade with each other, and let's have like security cooperation, but they distinctly don't want to go for the whole like NATO style thing. They don't want to go for the whole EU style thing where like let's cooperate more and more. Instead, it's just like, how about we just make sure we're strong against the world together? Does that sound good, everyone? That sounds good. And then they also have the agreement of like, how about we so tariffs between all countries going down. They want to make sure free trade, easy as possible, common air market, they want to get that done too. Every kind of business approach reform, it's going down in South America. And also, countries like free movement of people sort of is happening. So tourist visas, again, entirely liberalized. But a fun fact, Venezuela has like, no, it's Venezuela. I think it's Colombia, sorry, has some of the loosest restrictions on like how you can visit there from any country in the world. So wasn't too hard to apply. But all these countries have the same, restrictions on each other, i.e. none. And they're essentially trying to create one of the biggest single markets, because the thing about South American countries, with the exceptions of Brazil, again, just like ignore this part, is they have a common like Spanish, heritage on these sides. So Venezuela through to Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay and Bolivia, all Spanish-speaking worlds from the Spanish Empire. And then Brazil, they speak Brazilian Portuguese. But the similarities means they can kind of get each other, which is interesting if you ask me. But then, the other countries, there's only Suriname, which speaks Dutch, but then they speak some other stuff too. There's Guyana, which technically speaks English, but then other stuff too. And it basically means you have this interesting situation where the whole continent is unified in this like, oh yeah, it's going to be like a trade deal, but not really. And it makes me think of like, oh yeah, well, it's kind of like the United States of South America, but they definitely don't want to call themselves that, because there's just too many distinct political things going on here. I mean, like, truth be told, like, South America has some of the world's biggest political crisis of the last like couple of decades, right? Like Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, all getting together on one continent. But the truth is they're doing some good stuff to make it work, and that is the last of these transnational body things. And that is why, by the way, there's actually one more. I wanted to bring it up. It is CARICOM, because there is no, okay, so every continent has one. There's the EU, then there's 3 for Asia, then there's 1 for Africa, then there's, because, Middle East is kind of, oh, jeez. The Middle East is kind of its own thing, right? And Southeast Asia is kind of different because, like, it's just crazy hot and crazy stuff. And then if you think about it, China's its own place, but it has its own internal market. India's its own place, but it has its own internal thing. Same thing with Australia and New Zealand. But yeah, so America kind of has that going on. There is NAFTA, which is like the closest thing to a union between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. But the truth is like the United States has already got it down. They're already the largest military power, largest like economic power, and Canada kind of doesn't want to be a part of it anyway, so like how about they just maintain the status quo with a really liberal border, and then Mexico, like, anyway, point being is there is no union of that sort in North America, with the exception of CARICOM, which is kind of like a really short union of these countries which all agree to use the same currency, which is cool, but they were kind of using that before, and they mostly have histories as being British territories, or still are British territories, and I don't know, it exists, but it's not quite as fun as all the other ones. They're not quite as lofty goals, and yeah, I thought this was really interesting because basically the number of countries in the world is going up and going down at the same time, and the reason for that is, these big national bodies are slowly becoming countries in their own little way. So, for instance, at the G7, the EU is represented with their own person. Even though they're not a country and they're not the world's 7th largest economy, they kind of would be, and they're represented by the member states as well as a country. And it's just something we're going to see happen around the world, where the definition of country is slowly changing. But that's not a bad thing. That's that's kind of a good thing in some ways, and it might even leave because the US states are going the other way. Like, the US is slowly being a more and more centralized, country. Think about the president's power today versus a few, even 100 or 200 years ago. I guess that's the whole history of the country. But if you think about the president's power today, it's increasing more at the expense of the states. The fact that they can set these big laws about what the states can do on really minute issues. Drugs obviously comes to mind, but like any other issue like that, it's kind of crazy when you think about it that the US, the whole world is going towards like kind of like these federalized country blocks, and the US, despite being the most successful country in the world as a federalized country block, is going the other way and being like, what if we had like one guy led this all, and what if like that he was elected on a popularity contest. Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, let's keep moving towards that. And just interesting thoughts for the end of the video. Definition of country is changing, and I guess we'll see what happens in 50 years when I'm dead. So thank you very much. Well, actually, I won't be dead in 50 years. Well, I could be dead in 50 years. Who knows? But like 70 years when I'm dead. Let's see what happens there. Actually, maybe in 70 years we'll have like the technology so that people won't have to die anymore. We can because as soon as you can replicate consciousness, right, you don't have to die anymore. But assuming I don't have to deal with that crisis, I hope you all enjoy this video. Second channel, don't care. Bye.